The Louisiana sun hung low over the cane fields, casting long shadows across the plantation grounds. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of sugar and sweat mingling in a sickly sweet aroma that Charles Deslandes had long since grown accustomed to. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of cutting cane, gripped the machete with practiced precision. Each swing was measured, each cut deliberate. Unlike the others around him, whose movements betrayed their exhaustion, Charles maintained a steady rhythm, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. At 33 years old, Charles was no ordinary slave. Born on Saint-Domingue before the successful slave revolution there, he had been brought to Louisiana as a youth. Though he now served as a slave driver on the Andre plantation, the position afforded him no joy, only a marginally better existence and access to information. Information he had been quietly collecting for months. "Keep moving," shouted the white overseer, cracking his whip above the heads of the field hands. "Quotas ain't been met 3 days running. Colonel Andre ain't pleased." The workers barely flinched at the threat. They had heard it all before. What was one more whipping in a lifetime of pain? But Charles noticed the way young Isaac's shoulders tensed at the mention of Andre's name. The boy, no more than 16, bore fresh welts across his back from yesterday's punishment for dropping a bundle of cane. As the sun began to set, the workers were herded back toward the slave quarters. Charles walked slightly apart, his position as driver creating a buffer between him and the others. It was a division he hated, but had learned to use to his advantage. "Deslandes," the overseer's voice cut through the evening air. "Colonel wants to see you at the big house." Charles nodded, his face a careful mask of subservience that betrayed none of the rage that perpetually simmered beneath his skin. "Yes, sir." The Andre plantation house stood as a monument to wealth built on broken backs. Its white columns and sprawling veranda overlooked acres of cane fields that stretched to the horizon along the German coast of the Mississippi River. Named for the German settlers who had first claimed this land, the region had transformed into one of the wealthiest sugar-producing areas in the territory, with plantations lining both sides of the river. Inside the study, Colonel Manuel Andre sat behind a large mahogany desk, reviewing ledgers in the glow of oil lamps. At 57, Andre was an imposing figure, a militia commander, and one of the largest slaveholders in St. John the Baptist Parish. "Deslandes," Andre acknowledged without looking up. "Production is down." "Yes, Master Andre," Charles replied, his eyes fixed on a point just above the man's head. "The new workers from Virginia don't yet have the skill for cane cutting. They slow the lines." Andre finally looked up, his pale blue eyes cold, "then beat the skill into them. I paid good money for those slaves, and Governor Claiborne's latest regulations on importing more are driving prices up. I need every hand productive." Charles knew what Andre meant. Since the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, American laws had begun to clash with the French colonial system that had previously governed the territory. The influx of American planters and their slaves was changing the delicate balance that had existed before. "There's also talk," Andre continued, his voice dropping lower, "of unrest downriver, slaves getting ideas. You hear anything?" "No, Master Andre," Charles lied smoothly. "Nothing." Andre studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Keep your ears open. There are too many like you who came from Saint-Domingue, too many who remember Toussaint Louverture and his rebellion. We won't have that here." "Yes, sir," Charles replied, his face betraying nothing of the fire that name ignited in his chest. Toussaint Louverture, the slave who had led a successful revolution and forced the French from Haiti. A legend, a beacon. "That'll be all," Andre dismissed him with a wave. "And Deslandes, the Virginia boy, Isaac. Make an example of him tomorrow. He needs to learn his place." Charles felt his stomach turn but kept his expression neutral. "As you wish, Master." The walk back to the slave quarters took Charles past the communal cooking area, where a few women were preparing the evening meal, cornmeal and scraps of salt pork that barely qualified as sustenance after 14 hours in the fields. Among them was Dee, a woman in her 40s who had been on the plantation longer than most. Her eyes met Charles's briefly, a silent communication passing between them. Later, when darkness had fallen and the overseers had retired to their cabins, Charles made his way to Dee's small hut at the edge of the quarters. Inside, 5 men were already waiting. They sat in silence as Charles entered, their faces partially hidden in the shadows cast by a single candle. "Andre knows something," Charles said without preamble. "He mentioned unrest downriver." Kwamana, an older man with tribal scarification on his cheeks that marked his Akan heritage, shook his head. "It's too soon, we need more time." "Time is something we don't have," Charles replied. "And tomorrow I'm ordered to make an example of Isaac." The mention of the boy's name caused a shift in the room. Cook, a muscular man who had been captured in Africa as an adult and still spoke with a heavy accent, leaned forward. "The boy is Didi's sister's son. If I refuse, they'll just have someone else do it, and I'll lose my position." Charles cut him off. "And we need that position." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. These meetings had been occurring for months, ever since news had reached them of a successful minor revolt on the Poydras plantation further downriver. The American territorial governor, William C. Claiborne, had responded by increasing militia patrols, but it had also awakened something in the slaves of the German coast, a dangerous hope. "January is almost here," Charles continued. "The sugarcane harvest will be complete. The militia will be less vigilant. It's the time we've been waiting for." Didi, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "How many plantations are with us?" "From Andre's here to New Orleans. I've made contact with men on at least 8 estates," Charles replied. "Perhaps 200 could join us when it begins." "And the weapons?" asked Kwamana. "Each plantation has its armory for the militia. We take those first," Charles said. "But we need to finalize the plan now. Andre's suspicion means others may be watching too." The meeting continued late into the night, voices kept to whispers as they laid out the details of what would become the largest slave uprising in American history. Charles spoke of the routes they would take, moving downriver from plantation to plantation, gathering strength as they went, with New Orleans as their ultimate target. He spoke of the need for discipline, for organization, lessons learned from the Saint-Domingue Revolution. What he didn't speak of was the cost. They all knew it. Success meant freedom, perhaps escape to the northern territories, or even back to Haiti. Failure meant death, not just for them, but likely for countless innocent slaves who would face the planters' retribution. As the meeting disbanded, Didi caught Charles's arm. "And Isaac? What of tomorrow?" Charles's jaw tightened. "I'll do what I must to maintain our cover, but I'll speak to him tonight, explain what's coming, give him hope to endure it." Didi's eyes, filled with generations of sorrow, searched his. "Will it be worth it, Charles? All this pain we've endured, all that's still to come." Charles thought of Saint-Domingue, of the stories his mother had told him before she died of the fever, of a people who had thrown off their chains and claimed their humanity. "Freedom is always worth it," he said softly, "even if we die trying to grasp it." That night, as a light rain began to fall over the cane fields, Charles sat alone in his small cabin, one of the few privileges of his position as a driver. On the rough wooden table before him lay a map he had painstakingly drawn from memory, marking the plantations along the river, the roads, the militia posts. In 2 weeks' time, on the night of January 8, 1811, it would begin. As he traced the route with his finger, Charles thought of all the factors working both for and against them. The geography of the German coast created a natural corridor along the Mississippi, allowing for movement between plantations. The territorial transition from French to American rule had created confusion in the power structures. Many planters, like Andre, served as their own militia officers, meaning that killing them would remove both the immediate threat and the authority to organize resistance. But the obstacles were equally daunting. The slaves were outnumbered and outgunned. Many lacked fighting experience, and betrayal was always a risk. It would take only one person to reveal their plans for everything to collapse. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof of his cabin. Charles carefully folded the map and hid it beneath a loose floorboard. As he did, his fingers brushed against something else, a small wooden carving of a bird in flight that his mother had made for him before she died, a symbol of what seemed impossible, freedom. Tomorrow he would be forced to whip a boy to maintain his cover. In 2 weeks, he would lead men and women to either liberty or death. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a physical burden. As he extinguished his candle and lay down on his pallet, Charles de Landis made a silent vow. The cane fields of Louisiana had drunk enough slave blood. It was time for change, time for the masters to know fear. The uprising would succeed, or he would die trying. What he couldn't know, as sleep finally claimed him, was how the events he had set in motion would echo through American history, a desperate, bloody grasp for freedom that would shake the foundations of the young nation's slave society to its core. Isaac's screams echoed across the assembly yard, each crack of the whip drawing a fresh cry that seemed to pierce the morning mist. Charles Deslandes stood with his feet planted firmly on the packed dirt, his arm rising and falling with mechanical precision. His face was a stone mask, betraying nothing of the revulsion churning in his stomach. 20 lashes. A brutal sentence for dropping a bundle of cane. But Colonel Andre had been clear in his instructions. Make an example of the boy. The slaves of the Andre plantation stood in rows, forced to watch. Among them, Dee Dee's face was streaked with silent tears, as her nephew's back was transformed into a canvas of raw, bleeding welts. Charles had spoken to Isaac the night before, explaining what was to come, both the punishment and the rebellion that would follow. The boy had nodded, eyes wide with terror but also understanding. "One more," Andre called out from the veranda where he sipped his morning coffee, watching the proceedings with clinical detachment. "Make it count, Deslandes." Charles hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Andre's eyes to narrow, before delivering the final lash with enough force to satisfy his master, without doing additional damage to the barely conscious boy. "Get him to the infirmary," Andre instructed casually. "I need him back in the fields within 3 days." With that, he turned and went back inside, already moving on to the business of the day. 2 field hands gently lifted Isaac, his back a mess of torn flesh and blood. As they carried him away, the boy's eyes fluttered open, meeting Charles's gaze. There was no accusation there, only a grim resolve that seemed out of place on such a young face. The other slaves were dismissed to their daily tasks, dispersing silently, heads bowed but with sidelong glances that spoke volumes. Some held fear, others quiet rage. A few, those who knew of the plans, carried a dangerous hope. Charles wiped the blood from the whip, his movements deliberate as the overseer approached. "Andre's pleased with you," the man said, a twisted smile on his sunburnt face. "Says you're one of the good ones, know your place." Charles nodded, swallowing his hatred. "Just doing what's required, sir. Keep it up and maybe you'll get more privileges, maybe even papers someday." The suggestion that Charles might someday be granted his freedom through loyal service might have been tempting to some, but Charles had stopped believing in the master's promises long ago. Freedom was not something to be granted, it was something to be taken. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cane cutting and field management. Charles moved between work groups, keeping the pace steady, intervening when an overseer's attention was drawn to someone struggling. Small acts of protection, all he could offer for now. As evening approached, he was summoned once again to the big house. This time, Colonel Andre was not alone. William Claiborne, the territorial governor of Louisiana, sat opposite him, along with 2 other planters from nearby estates. Charles stood at attention just inside the door, waiting to be acknowledged. The conversation continued as if he weren't there. "The regulations are strangling us, Governor," one of the planters was saying, a portly man named Trepanier whose plantation lay downriver. "We can't import the workers we need, and the prices for domestic slaves are becoming prohibitive." Claiborne, a thin man with a perpetually worried expression, sighed. "I understand your concerns, gentlemen, but since the federal ban on the international slave trade, my hands are tied. President Madison is under pressure from northern states to enforce it strictly. Meanwhile, we hear rumors of slaves being smuggled into Florida by the Spanish," the other planter interjected. "They'll have the advantage in production if this continues." Andre cleared his throat. "There's another matter that concerns me more immediately, Governor. Unrest among the slaves. There have been incidents downriver." At this, Claiborne's attention sharpened. What sort of incidents? Small acts of defiance. Tools disappearing. A storehouse fire on the Kenner plantation that I doubt was accidental. Andre's eyes flicked briefly to Charles before continuing. And whispers of Saint-Domingue. The name hung in the air like a spectre. The Haitian Revolution had ended just 7 years earlier, sending shockwaves through every slave society in the Americas. Thousands of white planters had fled the island, many settling in Louisiana with their remaining slaves. The fear of similar uprisings taking root was a constant undercurrent in planter society. "I've increased militia patrols," Claiborne assured them, "and I've authorized harsher penalties for any slave found away from their plantation without proper papers." Trepanier snorted. "With respect, Governor, patrols aren't enough. We need to make examples. Public executions for troublemakers. It's the only language they understand. Charles felt a cold sweat break out along his spine, but kept his expression neutral, eyes downcast in the perfect picture of servility. "Delondes," Andre said suddenly, "you hear things the other drivers don't. Any truth to these concerns?" All eyes turned to Charles. This was the moment, a test of his loyalty, a potential trap. He chose his words with extreme care. "Master, the slaves talk, especially since the new Americans came with their slaves. They bring different ideas." He paused, giving them what they expected while revealing nothing of importance. "But most are too afraid to act on such talk. They've seen the punishments." Andre studied him for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "That'll be all. Return to your quarters." Charles bowed and backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. As he descended the steps of the big house, his mind raced. The meeting confirmed his worst fears. The planters were growing suspicious, and time was running short. They needed to move forward with the plan, perhaps even sooner than the proposed date of January 8th. Back at the slave quarters, the evening meal was being distributed, the usual meager portions that barely sustained the workers through their grueling days. Charles ate quickly, and then made his way to the small shed where tools were stored. Cook was there, ostensibly repairing a broken hoe handle. "We need to meet tonight," Charles murmured, pretending to inspect a machete blade. "All of us." Andre had the governor here talking about unrest. Cook gave a barely perceptible nod. After the night bell, Didi's cabin. Word spread quietly through the quarters. When darkness fell and the night bell had rung, signaling the time when all slaves were to be in their cabins, Charles waited an hour before slipping out. The overseers rarely patrolled this late, unless they suspected something, and Charles had made sure to display exemplary behavior since the morning's whipping. Didi's cabin was on the far edge of the quarters, partially obscured by a stand of cypress trees. Inside, the core group had already assembled. Kwamana, Cook, Didi, and 2 others. Jupiter from the neighboring Mouillon plantation, and Gisamine, a house slave from Andres, who had access to information from the big house. "How is Isaac?" Charles asked as he entered. "Fever's set in," Didi replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. "But the plantation doctor gave him something for the pain. He'll live. We may need to move sooner than planned," Charles said without preamble. "Andre suspects something. He met with Governor Claiborne today, discussing unrest among the slaves." Jupiter, a tall man with graying hair who had been smuggling messages between plantations, leaned forward. "We're not ready. The Bernard plantation hasn't confirmed their participation, and we need their numbers." "We may not have a choice," Charles countered. "If they increase militia patrols—" He was interrupted by Gisamine, who rarely spoke at these meetings. "There's more," she said quietly. "I was serving dinner. After you left, Charles, they continued talking. Trepanier suggested bringing in additional militia from Baton Rouge. Andre agreed. They're sending for them tomorrow." A heavy silence fell over the group. Additional militia would make their plan nearly impossible to execute. "January 8th is too late," Charles said firmly. "We need to move now, within the next 2 days. Kwamana shook his head. "That's madness, Charles. We need time to spread the word, to prepare." "We don't have time." Charles's voice rose slightly before he caught himself. "If we wait, we die. Or worse, we continue living as we are." The words hung in the air, a stark articulation of their reality. Slavery wasn't just the deprivation of freedom, it was a living death, a continuous humiliation and erasure of humanity. Cook, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Tomorrow night, we begin here, at Andres. Take the weapons from his militia storehouse, then move downriver as planned. Jupiter can ride ahead during the day to warn the others." The plan had always been to start at Andres' plantation, but the compressed timeline changed everything. They would have less preparation, less certainty of support from other plantations. "And if the other plantations aren't ready to join us?" Didi asked, giving voice to the fear they all shared. "Then we fight with who we have," Charles replied grimly. "Or we run to the swamps. Either way, it ends tomorrow night." The meeting continued late into the night as they refined their hastily adjusted plans. They would need to disable the bells that could raise an alarm, secure the road to prevent messengers from warning other plantations, and above all, maintain the element of surprise. As the others filtered out into the night, Didi held Charles back. "I need to show you something," she said, moving to the corner of her small cabin. From beneath a loose floorboard, similar to Charles's own hiding place, She withdrew a small cloth bundle. Unwrapping it carefully, she revealed a knife, not a kitchen knife or a field tool, but a proper dagger with a bone handle. "It belonged to my father," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "He came from Africa, brought it with him somehow, kept it hidden his whole life, waiting for the day he'd use it for his freedom." Her eyes, wet with unshed tears, met Charles's. "He died waiting. I won't make the same mistake." Charles placed his hand over hers, feeling the weight of the weapon between them. "Tomorrow night, that waiting ends. For all of us." The next day dawned grey and cold, a light drizzle falling that turned the plantation grounds to mud. Charles went about his duties as usual, distributing tools, organizing work crews, all while acutely aware that these routine actions were a facade. Beneath the surface, his mind was racing, rehearsing the plan, anticipating problems, preparing for the night to come. Mid-morning, Colonel Andrews summoned him again. This time the planter was reviewing a shipment of supplies that had arrived by riverboat. "Des Landes, I'm riding to New Orleans this afternoon. I should return by tomorrow evening. In my absence, you'll report to Overseer Campbell." Charles felt a surge of both relief and apprehension. Andrews' absence would make their initial attack easier, but his presence in New Orleans might accelerate the arrival of additional militia. "Yes, Master Andrew," he replied, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. "Will there be anything else?" Andrew hesitated, studying him with an intensity that made Charles wonder if the man somehow sensed what was coming. But then the moment passed, and Andrew shook his head. "No, just keep the quotas up. The rain shouldn't slow production." "Of course, Master." As Charles walked away, he felt Andrew's eyes on his back. The weight of what was to come pressed down on him with each step. By this time tomorrow, many people would be dead. Slaves, masters, perhaps Charles himself. Violence was not something he sought. It was something that had been visited upon him and his people for generations. Now it would be returned in kind. The day crawled by, each hour stretching interminably as Charles maintained his normal routine. He checked on Isaac in the infirmary, finding the boy conscious but weak, his back a mass of inflamed welts. Their eyes met in silent communication. No words were needed. Late in the afternoon, as predicted, Colonel Andrew departed for New Orleans, accompanied by a single house slave. Charles watched them go, the horses' hooves splashing through puddles as they disappeared down the road that led to the river landing. When darkness fell, the rain had stopped, but a heavy mist hung over the plantation, shrouding everything in a ghostly haze. Charles waited in his cabin, counting the minutes until the night bell rang. After that, he gave it another hour for the overseers to complete their cursory checks and retire to their quarters. Finally, at around 10 o'clock, he slipped out into the night. The rendezvous point was not Dady's cabin this time, but the edge of the sugarcane field nearest the overseer's house and the militia storehouse. There, shadows gradually materialized from the mist. First Cook and Quamana, then Jupiter, who had returned from his mission to warn the neighboring plantations. A dozen others joined them, men Charles had carefully selected for their strength and resolve. No one spoke. They had rehearsed this moment in whispered conversations over many months. Each knew their role. Cook and two others would subdue the night watchman. Jupiter and his group would secure the road to prevent escape or messengers. Charles, Quamana, and the remainder would take the militia storehouse and distribute the weapons within. Charles gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and they moved out, ghost-like in the mist. The compound was quiet, most of its white inhabitants asleep. The only light came from the overseer's house, where a single window glowed dimly. They reached the storehouse without incident. The lock was heavy but yielded to the pry bar Charles had hidden earlier that day. Inside, the armory was modest but sufficient. Muskets, powder, shot, and, most valuable of all, several sabers that would give them a crucial advantage in close combat. As they were distributing the weapons, a shout rang out from the direction of the overseer's house, followed by the crack of a pistol shot. Charles's heart leaped into his throat. Something had gone wrong. "Go," he hissed to the others. "Stick to the plan." Grabbing a saber and a pistol, Charles ran toward the sound of the disturbance. The scene that greeted him was one of chaos. Campbell, the overseer, was on his porch, discharging a second pistol at the slaves surrounding his house. One of their men was down, clutching his leg. Cook and the others had fallen back, momentarily stymied by the unexpected resistance. Without hesitation, Charles raised his pistol and fired. The ball struck Campbell in the chest, and the overseer crumpled to the ground. The sound of the shot seemed to hang in the air, a declaration that could not be taken back. There would be no turning back now, no clemency, no explanations. They had crossed a line that would forever separate this night from all that had come before. "To the main house," Charles ordered, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Secure any weapons there, then we move downriver as planned." The others fell in behind him, newly armed with the instruments of their liberation. As they approached the Andre mansion, Charles felt a strange calm descend over him. The die was cast. Whatever came next, freedom or death, at least they had chosen their path. They swept through the big house, finding it mostly empty with Andre away. The few house slaves they encountered either joined them willingly or were secured to prevent them from raising an alarm. Jessamine met them inside, her face a mask of determination as she handed Charles a set of keys. "These open the strongbox in his study," she said. "There's money there, and documents, including some freedom papers that might be useful." Charles nodded his thanks, pocketing the keys. "Is everyone accounted for?" "All except Didi," Kwamana replied, appearing at his side. "She went to get Isaac from the infirmary." As if summoned by her name, Didi appeared at the entrance to the mansion, supporting Isaac, who could barely walk. The boy's face was ashen with pain, but his eyes burned with the same fire that had ignited in all of them. "We're ready," Didi said simply, her father's knife now openly displayed at her waist. Charles looked around at the assembled faces, some frightened, some resolute, all changed irrevocably by what they had just done and what still lay ahead. Nearly 40 slaves from the Andre plantation had joined the uprising, with more potentially waiting at the neighboring estates. "Tonight we are no longer slaves," Charles declared, his voice ringing through the halls of the house that had for so long symbolized their oppression. "Tonight we fight for our freedom, for our humanity. Some of us may fall, but those who survive will never again bow to any master." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, growing into a swell of determination. Outside, the mist continued to shroud the plantation in an ethereal glow, as if the very land was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Charles Deslandes raised his saber, the weapon of the oppressor now turned against the system it had protected. Forward, to freedom or death. They moved out into the night, leaving behind the only world many of them had ever known, marching toward an uncertain destiny that they had claimed as their own. The German coast uprising had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the long, bloody struggle for liberty on American soil. Dawn broke over the Andre plantation, the rising sun burning away the mist to reveal a landscape transformed. The big house stood empty, its doors flung wide, items scattered across the manicured lawn where looters had dropped them. The overseer's body lay where he had fallen, already drawing flies in the growing heat. The slave quarters were abandoned, cooking fires cold, possessions left behind in the hasty exodus. And on the river road that paralleled the Mississippi, a column of nearly 40 armed slaves moved with purpose toward the next plantation downriver. At their head marched Charles Deslandes, the saber he had taken from Andre's armory glinting in the early morning light. Behind him came Cook and Kwamana, leading a disciplined formation that bore little resemblance to the desperate rabble that planters had always feared. This was an army, however small, with a chain of command and a clear objective. "Mouillon Plantation is next," Charles called back to those immediately behind him. "Jupiter says they're ready for us. After that we hit Bernard's." Word of their uprising had spread ahead of them, carried by Jupiter and other trusted messengers who had slipped away in the preceding days. If all went according to plan, slaves from each plantation would join their ranks as they advanced, swelling their numbers as they moved inexorably toward New Orleans. Isaac rode in a small cart they had taken from Andre's stable, his wounds making it impossible for him to march. Dadi walked alongside, keeping a watchful eye on her nephew. The boy's face was flushed with fever, but his eyes were clear and alert, taking in everything. "How far to Mouillon's?" he asked, his voice thin but determined. "Less than an hour," Didi replied, adjusting the cloth she had soaked in cool water and placed on his forehead. "Rest now. You'll need your strength later." Isaac shook his head stubbornly. "I want to see everything. I need to remember." Didi understood. Whether they succeeded or failed, this march was historic, something to be remembered and passed down. If they lived, The column moved at a steady pace, keeping to the river road rather than trying to hide their movement. Speed and momentum were their allies now. Each plantation they seized would add to their forces and supplies while denying the same to the territorial militia that would inevitably be mustered against them. As they approached the Mouillon plantation, Charles raised his hand, bringing the column to a halt. He motioned for Cook and Kwamana to join him at the front. Jupiter said they'd have a signal, Charles said, scanning the plantation buildings visible through the trees. Something to let us know if it's safe to approach. Cook pointed toward the fields, where a few slaves could be seen working. Look at the hats. Charles narrowed his eyes. Each of the field hands visible from the road wore a red cloth tied around their straw hats, the signal they had arranged. The overseers were nowhere to be seen. It's done, Charles said with a grim smile. They've already taken control. As they resumed their march, a small group of armed slaves emerged from the tree line to meet them. Their leader, a tall man named Samuel, who had been Jupiter's main contact, stepped forward. "Welcome to free soil, brothers and sisters," he said, extending his hand to Charles. "We took the plantation at first light. The master and 2 overseers are dead. The rest are tied up in the storehouse." Charles clasped the man's hand firmly. "Any casualties on our side?" "1 dead, 2 wounded," Samuel replied, his expression somber. "But the rest are ready to join you. 25 more fighters, plus those who can't fight but want to come anyway." Charles nodded. Each plantation would have its non-combatants, the elderly, the very young, the infirm. They couldn't be left behind to face the wrath of the planters once news of the uprising spread, but they would slow the march and consume precious resources. "Have them gather what food they can carry," Charles instructed, "and any weapons not being used by your fighters. We move out within the hour." While Samuel went to organize his people, Charles and his lieutenants took stock of their situation. 2 plantations secured, with at least 60 armed fighters now under their banner. It was a promising start, but still far from the force they would need to have any hope against the militias that would soon be rallying against them. Gisèle approached, her expression troubled. "Charles, there's something you should know. One of the Mouillon house slaves escaped during their uprising, a man named Henri. He was the master's personal servant and completely loyal to him." Charles felt a chill despite the growing heat of the day. "Which direction did he flee?" "Toward New Orleans," Samuel confirmed, rejoining them. "We sent 2 men after him, but he had too much of a head start." This was the news Charles had been dreading. Their element of surprise, already tenuous, was now completely shattered. If Henri reached New Orleans or any militia post along the way, the alarm would be raised, and organized resistance would quickly materialize. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Charles decided after a moment's consideration. "No more hour-long stops. We take what and who we can in 20 minutes, then continue downriver." Cook frowned. "Many won't be able to keep up that pace." "Then they follow as they can," Charles replied, his voice hardening. "We need to reach Bernard's plantation before word of our approach does. After that, it's a straight march to the city." As the Mouillon slaves prepared to join them, Charles pulled Gisèle aside. "I need you to draft a proclamation," he said quietly. "Something we can distribute at each plantation we take, explaining our purpose." Gisèle had been educated alongside her mistress as a child, a not uncommon practice for house slaves intended to serve as companions. She could read and write better than most white people in the territory. "What should it say?" she asked, already mentally composing the document. "That we fight for freedom, not vengeance," Charles replied. "That we are men and women claiming our natural rights, not savages bent on slaughter. Make it clear that any slave who joins us will be welcomed, any who oppose us." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Gisèle nodded. "I'll have it ready before we reach Bernard's." Within the hour, their numbers swelled by the Mouillon contingent. The column resumed its march downriver. The river road was remarkably empty of traffic, a stroke of luck that Charles knew wouldn't last. Soon enough, word would spread, and panicked planters would be fleeing upriver, while militia forces would be rushing down to confront them. As they marched, Charles moved among the ranks, speaking briefly with each group, assessing their readiness, bolstering their courage. Many were understandably frightened, having never before raised a hand against a white person. Others were almost giddy with the newfound power of being armed and in control of their destiny, a dangerous state that could lead to recklessness. "Remember," Charles told them all, "discipline is our strength. We move together, we fight together, we live or die together." By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, and the humidity had returned with a vengeance. The column had grown to nearly 70 armed fighters, with another 30 non-combatants trailing behind. They had passed several smaller farms along the way, liberating the handful of slaves at each and putting the buildings to the torch. Smoke now rose from multiple points along the river, visible for miles, a beacon announcing their passage that couldn't be ignored. When they were within sight of the Bernard plantation, one of their scouts returned at a run, his face tight with urgency. "Militia!" he gasped, pointing back the way they had come. About 20 men on horseback, maybe 2 miles back, moving fast. Charles felt time compress around him. This was the moment when their revolution would be truly tested. Until now, they had faced only individual overseers and planters, taken by surprise. This would be their first encounter with organized resistance. "Kwamana, take 30 men and set up an ambush at the bend in the road we just passed," Charles ordered swiftly. "There's cover in those trees, and the road narrows." "It's perfect." "And the rest of us?" Cook asked, already checking his musket. "We continue to Bernard's as planned. We need those additional fighters and supplies." Charles turned to Didi. "Get the non-combatants off the road. There's a cane field to the south that should provide temporary cover." As Kwamana led his group back toward the bend in the road, Charles turned to Jupiter. "You know Bernard's layout best. How should we approach?" Jupiter, who had been traded to Andres from Bernard's only a year earlier, quickly sketched a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "Main house is here, slave quarters here. The armory is attached to the overseer's house at the back, but Bernard keeps most of his militia supplies in a separate storehouse here, behind the stables." Charles studied the impromptu map, formulating a plan. "We'll split into 3 groups. Jupiter, you take 15 men and secure the armory. Cook, you and another 15 take the main house. I'll lead the rest to liberate the quarters and gather the Bernard slaves." The plan was sound, but everything depended on timing now. If Kwamana could delay the militia behind them, they might have just enough time to seize Bernard's and incorporate its slaves into their force before facing a direct confrontation. As they approached Bernard's plantation, they maintained the disciplined column formation until they were within sight of the first buildings. Then, on Charles's signal, they broke into their assigned groups and fanned out, moving quickly toward their objectives. Charles led his contingent toward the slave quarters, which were arranged in 2 long rows of cabins. As they drew closer, he could see faces peering from doorways and windows, curious, frightened, hopeful. Word of their coming had clearly preceded them. An older man stepped out from the nearest cabin, his posture wary but his eyes alert. "You Delonde?" he asked without preamble. Charles nodded. "Jupiter sent word." "He did. Some are ready to join you. Others are afraid. And you?" The old man's eyes flicked to the saber at Charles's side, then back to his face. "I'm too old to fight, but my sons aren't." He turned and called out something, and 2 younger men emerged from the cabin already dressed for travel, crude weapons in hand. Similar scenes played out at each cabin as Charles's group moved through the quarters. Some joined without hesitation, while others hung back, weighing the enormous risk against the promise of freedom. Charles didn't force anyone. Coercion was the tool of the masters, not the liberators. In the distance, the crack of musket fire erupted, Kwamana engaging the militia. The sound galvanized the hesitant, making the stakes clear. This wasn't a theoretical revolution. It was happening now, and choices had to be made immediately. More gunfire, this time from the direction of the main house. Cook's group had encountered resistance. Charles quickened his pace, gathering those who had chosen to join them. "To the main house," he ordered. "Cook needs support." They moved at a run, the newest recruits falling in behind the more experienced fighters from Andres and Mouillons. As they rounded the corner of the overseer's house, they came upon a scene of chaos. Cook and his men were exchanging fire with several armed whites who had barricaded themselves on the veranda of the main house. 2 of the revolutionaries lay motionless on the ground, while another clutched a wounded arm. Charles quickly assessed the situation. The whites had the advantage of elevation and cover, making a frontal assault costly. But time was not on their side. The distant gunfire from Kwamana's position had grown more intense, suggesting the militia engagement was escalating. "Around the back," Charles decided. "There's a servant's entrance. Cook maintained fire on the front to keep them pinned down." Leading 20 men around the side of the house, Charles found the servant's entrance unguarded. They rushed in, moving swiftly through the kitchen and dining room toward the front of the house. 2 house slaves they encountered simply stood aside, their expressions unreadable. At the front, they caught Bernard and his men by surprise, attacking from behind while they were focused on Cook's group outside. The fighting was brief but brutal, ending with Bernard and his son dead, and 3 others surrendering. "Secure them," Charles ordered, already moving back outside to signal Cook. "Jupiter, report." Jupiter appeared from the direction of the stables, a fresh cut on his cheek but otherwise intact. "Armory secured. We found muskets, pistols, and plenty of ammunition." "Good. Distribute them to those who can fight." "What about—" The rest of his question was cut off by the arrival of a breathless messenger from Kwamana's position. "They're pushing us back," the man gasped. "Militia has swivel guns mounted on flatboats in the river. They're firing on our position from the water." Charles felt a surge of alarm. Swivel guns, small cannon mounted on boats, could devastate their positions with grape shot. This was no longer a simple militia response. The territorial authorities were deploying serious firepower. "Kwamana?" "Still holding, but says he can't for long. Maybe 15 minutes. Charles made a swift calculation. "Jupiter, get everyone armed and ready to move out. Cook, gather all the food and supplies we can carry. We need to be ready to march in 10 minutes. As his lieutenants rushed to comply, Charles sought out Jizamin. "The proclamation?" She handed him a folded paper. "It's done. I made 3 copies." Charles scanned the document quickly. It was well crafted, articulating their demands for freedom and justice while emphasizing their humanity and natural rights. The language was elevated, designed to speak to both the slaves they hoped would join them and the authorities they would eventually have to negotiate with. "Perfect," he said, tucking it inside his coat. "Spread these among the different groups. If we get separated, each leader should have one." The sound of gunfire from Kwamana's position intensified, then began to taper off, a bad sign. Charles knew they were running out of time. "Everyone move out," he shouted. "Form up on the road, we march now." The newly enlarged Revolutionary Army, now numbering nearly 100 armed fighters plus non-combatants, began to assemble on the river road. Charles stationed armed men at the front and rear of the column, with the less experienced and non-combatants protected in the center. Just as they were about to move out, Kwamana arrived with his men, many wounded, all exhausted. "We held as long as we could," he reported grimly. "Killed 4 of them, but they're still coming, and there are more boats on the river moving parallel to us." Charles nodded, having already anticipated this development. "We can't continue on the river road. They'll pin us between the militia on land and the boats on the water." "So what's the alternative?" Cook asked. Charles pointed inland, away from the river. "We cut through the cane fields and head for the cypress swamps. The boats can't follow us there, and horsemen will have a harder time maneuvering." There were murmurs of concern among the ranks. The swamps were treacherous, full of quicksand, venomous snakes, and alligators. But they also offered concealment and would neutralize many of the advantages the militia held. "What about New Orleans?" Kwamana asked. "Wasn't that the plan?" Charles shook his head. "The plan has changed. We don't have the numbers or firepower to take the city, not with the authorities alerted and prepared, but we can still win our freedom." "How?" several voices asked at once. "The territory of Orleans shares a border with Spanish West Florida," Charles explained, pointing southeast. "If we can reach Spanish territory, they might grant us sanctuary." It was a desperate plan, born of necessity rather than choice. Spain and the United States were engaged in a tense territorial dispute, with Spain still claiming parts of West Florida that the Americans insisted were included in the Louisiana Purchase. Spanish authorities might be willing to shelter the escaped slaves simply to antagonize the Americans. "It's at least 60 miles through swamp and forest," Cook pointed out, "with militia hunting us the whole way." "Better than certain death here," Charles replied. "And we won't all travel together. That makes us too easy to track. We'll break into smaller groups, each with a leader who knows the rendezvous point." The sound of approaching hoofbeats galvanized them into action. There was no more time for debate. "Divide into groups of no more than 20, Charles ordered. "Each group takes a different route east and south. We meet at Bayou Bienvenue in 3 days." Quickly, the Revolutionary Army fractured into smaller bands. Charles would lead one, with Kwamana, Cook, Jupiter, and Didi each leading others. Isaac, still too weak to walk, would travel with Didi's group. As they prepared to disperse, Charles gathered the leaders for a final word. "Remember what we fight for," he said, his voice low but intense. "Not just our own freedom, but the freedom of all our people. If we reach Spanish territory, we negotiate not just for ourselves, but for those left behind. And if we fall," he paused, meeting each pair of eyes in turn, "if we fall, we do so as free men and women who chose our own path." With that, the groups began to melt away into the cane fields, heading for the tree line that marked the beginning of the cypress swamps. Charles watched them go, hoping that at least some would make it to the rendezvous point. Then, with his own group of 18 fighters, he too plunged into the dense growth, leaving the river road and the plantations behind. As they pushed deeper into the swamp, wading through shallow water and clambering over fallen trees, Charles reflected on how drastically their plan had evolved in just a day. The triumphant march on New Orleans had transformed into a desperate flight toward an uncertain sanctuary. Yet there was still purpose in their struggle, still meaning in their defiance. The German coast uprising might not end in the liberation of New Orleans, but it would be remembered. It would send shockwaves through the territory of Orleans and beyond, forcing white Americans to confront the reality that their slave society was built on unstable ground. And for those involved, whatever the outcome, they had experienced something precious and irreplaceable, the dignity of choosing their own fate. As darkness began to fall, Charles led his group to a small rise of relatively dry ground. They would rest here briefly before continuing through the night, using the stars to navigate. The swamp was alive with sounds, the buzz of insects, the occasional splash of something entering the water, the distant call of birds settling for the night. One of the younger men, a field hand from Mouillons named Thomas, approached Charles as the others were arranging a makeshift camp. "Do you think we'll make it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles considered the question, weighing the young man's need for encouragement against his own commitment to honesty. "Some of us will," he replied finally. "Enough to matter." Thomas nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. "That's all we can ask for, isn't it? A chance to matter." As the young man moved away, Charles stared out into the gathering darkness of the swamp. Yes, he thought, a chance to matter. A chance to be remembered as something more than property. A chance to write their own names in the book of history, however brief the entry might be. The revolution they had begun would continue its march, even if they themselves were cut down. The idea that slaves could and would fight for their freedom had been planted, and ideas once unleashed were impossible to recapture. With this thought to sustain him, Charles Deslandes began planning their night's journey through the treacherous swamps of Louisiana, each step taking them further from bondage and closer to whatever fate awaited them beyond. The swamp closed around them like a living entity, dense and primordial. 3 days had passed since Charles and his band had fled the river road, 3 days of wading through murky water, fighting off mosquitoes and watching for snakes, 3 days of rationing their dwindling supplies while straining to detect any sound that might indicate pursuit. They had lost 2 men already, not to militia bullets but to the swamp itself. One had stepped into a sinkhole and been pulled under before anyone could react. Another had succumbed to a venomous snake bite, his body left on a small hummock of land covered with branches in the closest thing to a burial they could manage. Now, as the weak winter sun began to descend toward the horizon once more, Charles led his diminished group toward Bayou Bienvenue, the rendezvous point where, if fortune favored them, they would reunite with the other bands of revolutionaries. "We're close," Charles murmured to Quamina, who had chosen to stay with his group rather than lead one of his own. "Should reach the bayou by nightfall." The older man nodded, his face gaunt from the journey, but his eyes still alert. "And if the others don't come? We wait 1 day. No longer. The militia will be sweeping these swamps, and we need to keep moving towards Spanish territory." They continued in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The initial fervor of rebellion had given way to a grim determination to survive, to ensure that their uprising would not be just another footnote in the bloody history of slave resistance. As they approached a clearing that offered a view of the sky, Charles raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt. Something was wrong. The birds had gone silent, and there was a faint smell in the air, wood smoke. "Down!" he whispered, and the group immediately crouched low among the cypress knees and hanging moss. Charles crawled forward alone, moving with the practiced stealth of a man accustomed to avoiding notice. At the edge of the clearing, He peered through a screen of vegetation and felt his heart sink. Militia. At least a dozen men in the blue uniforms of the Territorial Army with another group of planters in civilian clothes. They had established a temporary camp on the only substantial dry ground near the bayou, directly at the rendezvous point. Worse still, they had prisoners. Charles could make out several black figures bound to trees at the edge of the camp. His eyes strained to identify them in the fading light. Was that Jupiter among them, and perhaps one of the Bernard plantation men? He couldn't be sure. Silently, Charles retreated to where his group waited. "Militia at the rendezvous," he reported in a hushed voice. "They have prisoners." "Our people?" Kwamana asked. "I think so. I may have seen Jupiter." A murmur ran through the group. Jupiter had been leading one of the largest bands, nearly 20 fighters strong. If they had been captured, it didn't bode well for the others. "What do we do?" Thomas asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Charles considered their options, none of them good. They could abandon the rendezvous and continue toward Spanish territory, potentially leaving their comrades to die. They could try to free the prisoners, though they were outnumbered and would be attacking an alert, prepared force. Or they could wait and observe, hoping to gather more information while risking discovery themselves. "We need to know more," he decided finally. "How many prisoners? How many militia? And whether any of our other groups have been captured or are nearby." "I'll go," offered a woman named Marie who had joined them from Bernard's plantation. "I can move quietly and they'll be less suspicious of a woman if I'm spotted." Charles nodded his agreement. Marie had proven herself both brave and resourceful during their journey through the swamp. "Be careful. Just observe and return. Don't take any risks." As Marie slipped away toward the militia camp, Charles organized the rest of the group into a defensive perimeter. If they were discovered, they would need to be ready to fight or flee instantly. The wait seemed interminable. The sun set and darkness fell over the swamp, bringing with it a chorus of frogs and insects that helped mask any sounds of movement. Finally, after what felt like hours, Marie returned, moving so silently that she was among them before Charles realized it. 8 prisoners, she reported without preamble. Jupiter is among them, and 2 women from Cook's group. The others I didn't recognize. 22 militia and planters, all armed. They have dogs too, though they're keeping them quiet for now. Did you hear anything about other captures? Or about Didi's group? Charles asked, thinking of Isaac and hoping the boy had somehow evaded the militia dragnet. Marie shook her head. Nothing specific, but they were talking about sweeping the swamp systematically. One mentioned that the governor has called out the full militia, hundreds of men. They're hunting all of us, Charles. This news, while expected, still hit with the force of a physical blow. Their small revolution, which had begun with such promise, was being methodically crushed. "What about the prisoners?" Kwamana asked. "What's to become of them?" Marie's expression darkened. "They're to be taken back to New Orleans tomorrow, for public execution." A heavy silence fell over the group. Public execution. A message to any slave who might dream of following their example. It was a common tactic, one the planters had used for generations to instill terror and quash resistance. "We have to try to free them," Thomas said, his young face resolute in the darkness. "We can't leave them to die like that." Several others nodded in agreement, but Charles hesitated. With just 16 fighters remaining in his group, attacking a force of 22 well-armed militia was close to suicide. Yet the thought of abandoning Jupiter and the others to their fate was equally unpalatable. "If we're going to do this, we need a diversion," Charles said finally. "Something to draw off some of their force." "Fire," suggested Kwamana. "The swamp is dry enough in patches. We could set several fires around their perimeter, make them think they're being surrounded." It was a dangerous strategy. Fire in the swamp could quickly become uncontrollable, but it might create enough chaos to allow for a rescue attempt. "We'll need to be precise," Charles cautioned. "Set the fires far enough away that they draw attention, but don't immediately threaten the camp. We want them to send men to investigate, not to flee with the prisoners." The plan took shape quickly. They would divide into 3 groups, one to set the fires, one to attack the weakened camp from the north, and one to free the prisoners in the confusion. Charles would lead the rescue group himself. As they made their final preparations, Charles pulled Kwamana aside. "If this goes wrong," he said quietly, "someone needs to continue toward Spanish territory. Someone needs to survive to tell our story." Kwamana's weathered face was solemn in the moonlight that filtered through the cypress canopy. "It won't be me, Charles. I'm too old to start again. This is my fight, here and now." Charles clasped the older man's shoulder, understanding completely. For men like Kwamana, who had spent a lifetime in chains, the uprising was not just about securing their own freedom. It was about striking a blow against the system itself, regardless of personal survival. "Then let's make it count," Charles said simply. The attack was set for the darkest hour of the night, just before dawn, when the militia's vigilance would be at its lowest ebb. The fire-setters left first, circling wide around the camp to approach from the south and west. Charles and his rescue team of 5 took position to the east, closest to where the prisoners were bound. The attack group, led by Kwamana, would come from the north once the fires were blazing. As they waited, Charles felt a strange calm descend over him. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine not just his fate, but how their uprising would be remembered. If they succeeded in freeing the prisoners and escaping, the legend of their rebellion would grow. If they failed, they would at least fall fighting, providing another chapter in the long story of resistance that stretched back generations. The first fire bloomed in the darkness to the south, a sudden flare of orange against the black silhouette of the cypress trees. Shouts immediately erupted from the militia camp, followed by the barking of dogs. A second fire appeared to the west, then a third. "They're moving," whispered Marie, who was part of Charles's rescue team. "At least 8 men heading toward the fires." Charles waited until he was certain a significant portion of the militia had been drawn away before giving the signal to advance. His group moved silently through the underbrush, approaching the camp from its most vulnerable side. The remaining militia were focused on the fires, several standing at the perimeter peering into the darkness, others hurriedly gathering equipment in case they needed to evacuate. The prisoners, still bound to trees at the edge of the camp, were momentarily unguarded. Charles was within 20 yards of Jupiter when the attack began. Kwamana's group charged from the north, firing a volley that dropped 2 militia immediately. The camp erupted into chaos, men scrambling for weapons, shouting contradictory orders. "Now!" Charles hissed, and his rescue team surged forward. They reached the prisoners unopposed, quickly cutting the ropes that bound them. Jupiter, though weakened, was on his feet instantly. "Charles," he gasped, "thank God they captured us yesterday, ambushed us at the edge of the swamp." "No time," Charles replied, pressing a knife into Jupiter's hand. "Help free the others. We need to move before—" His words were cut short by a volley of musket fire from the center of the camp. The militia had organized a defense more quickly than anticipated. One of the rescue team crumpled to the ground, shot through the chest. "Go!" Charles shouted, pushing Jupiter toward the cover of the swamp. "Head east. We'll cover you." As the freed prisoners staggered toward safety, Charles and the remaining rescuers provided covering fire. The night was now fully illuminated by the spreading fires, casting a hellish glow over the scene of battle. Men moved like shadows in the flickering light, the crack of muskets and screams of the wounded, creating a cacophony that seemed to consume the very air. Charles emptied his pistol at a militiaman who was taking aim at the fleeing prisoners, then drew his saber as another charged toward him. The blade, once the symbol of a master's authority, now became an instrument of retribution in his hands. He parried the militia's bayonet thrust and countered with a slash that opened the man's throat. From the north, Kwamana's attack was faltering as militia reinforcements returned from investigating the fires. Charles saw the old man standing his ground, firing a musket and then using it as a club when ammunition ran out. "Fall back!" Charles shouted. "To the swamp! Fall back!" Some heard and obeyed, retreating toward the agreed rendezvous point east of the camp. Others were too engaged in the desperate hand-to-hand combat that had erupted throughout the camp. Charles fought his way toward Kwamana, determined not to leave the old warrior behind. He cut down another militiaman who blocked his path, the saber now slick with blood in his grip. "Kwamana!" he called. "We need to go!" The older man turned at the sound of his name, and in that moment of distraction, a militia officer fired a pistol at point-blank range. Kwamana staggered, but remained upright, summoning some final reserve of strength to drive his knife into his attacker's chest, even as his own life ebbed away. Charles reached him just as he fell. "Leave me!" Kwamana gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "I'm finished. Save the others." Before Charles could respond, a searing pain tore through his left shoulder, a musket ball fired from somewhere in the chaos. He stumbled, but kept his feet, half dragging Kwamana toward the edge of the camp. "I said leave me," the old man insisted, his voice fading. "My journey ends here, But yours continues. Remember what we fought for, Charles. Make it mean something." With a final surge of strength, Kwamana pushed Charles away just as another volley of musket fire erupted from the militia line. Multiple balls struck the old warrior, ending his struggle at last. Charles felt a roar of grief and rage tear from his throat, but hands were pulling him away. Marie and Thomas dragging him toward the swamp despite his resistance. "He's gone," Marie hissed. "We need to go now, or we all die here." The rational part of Charles's mind knew she was right. The battle was lost. The fires, meant as a diversion, were now sweeping toward the camp, threatening friend and foe alike. Those revolutionaries still alive needed to escape while the confusion lasted. Clutching his wounded shoulder, Charles allowed himself to be led into the protective darkness of the swamp. Behind them, the militia camp was devolving into further chaos as the fires reached its perimeter, tents and supplies catching ablaze. They retreated for nearly an hour, pushing deeper into the swamp until the sounds of battle faded completely. At a small, relatively dry hummock, they finally stopped to assess their situation. Of Charles's original group of 16, only 9 remained. They had managed to free all 8 prisoners, though 2 had been wounded in the escape. In total, 15 bedraggled revolutionaries huddled in the pre-dawn darkness, their brief moment of victory already fading in the face of grim reality. "What now?" Jupiter asked, his voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. "The rendezvous is compromised. The militia will be hunting us with everything they have." Charles, his wound roughly bandaged by Marie, looked at the haggard faces surrounding him. They had already sacrificed so much, lost so many. Could he ask them to continue this increasingly desperate flight? "We still head for Spanish territory," he decided finally. "It's our only chance. But we'll need to be more careful. Move only at night, avoid any sign of habitation." "And if we make it?" Thomas asked. "What then?" It was the question that had driven them from the beginning, the hope that had sustained them through the horrors of the past days. What would freedom actually mean? "Then we build something new," Charles replied, his voice finding strength despite his injury. "Something that honors those we've lost. Kwamana, and all the others who fell so that we might have this chance." As the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the cypress canopy, the surviving revolutionaries gathered what meager supplies they had and prepared to move out. Their uprising, which had begun with such bold ambition on the Andre plantation, had been reduced to this small band of fugitives. Yet in their defiance, in their refusal to accept the fate that white society had prescribed for them, they had already achieved something remarkable. They had proven that slaves would fight for their freedom, would die for it if necessary. They had sent a message that would resonate through the territory of Orleans and beyond, a declaration that the system of human bondage was vulnerable, that it survived only through constant vigilance and violence. Charles Delonde, leading his battered band deeper into the swamp as the new day dawned, couldn't know how their story would be told in years to come. He couldn't know that their uprising would be remembered as the largest slave rebellion in American history until that point, that it would send shockwaves through the slaveholding South and contribute to the paranoia that would characterize race relations for decades. All he knew was that they were still free, still fighting, still human in a world that had tried to reduce them to property. And for now, that would have to be enough. As they moved eastward, toward the uncertain sanctuary of Spanish territory, the smoke from the burning militia camp rose behind them, a dark column against the lightening sky, a fitting monument to the blood that had been spilled in the name of freedom. 2 weeks after the battle at Bayou Bienvenu, Charles Delondes lay hidden in the attic of a small cabin deep in the marshlands near the Spanish border. His shoulder wound had festered, leaving him feverish and weak. Of the 15 revolutionaries who had escaped the militia camp, only 7 remained with him. The others had either been captured in subsequent militia sweeps or had decided to take their chances alone. Marie gently changed the poultice on his wound, her face grim as she noted the angry red streaks extending from the infection. "It's getting worse," she murmured. "We need real medicine." Charles nodded weakly. They had been sheltered for the past 3 days by a free black fisherman named Baptiste, who lived in this isolated cabin with his wife Eulalie. The couple had risked everything to hide the fugitives, providing food and basic medical care while keeping watch for militia patrols. "Any news?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marie hesitated before answering. "Baptiste returned from the settlement. It's not good, Charles." Despite his weakness, Charles pushed himself up on his good elbow. "Tell me." They're executing our people. Public spectacle. 23 so far, with more to come. Marie's voice caught. They've put their heads on pikes along the river road as a warning. Charles closed his eyes, absorbing the grim news. They had known the planters' retribution would be severe, but the scale of the executions spoke to the depth of fear their uprising had instilled. Names? He asked after a moment. Cook was among them, Marie replied softly. And others from Andres and Murions. Baptiste didn't know all the names. Didi, Isaac? Marie shook her head. No word. They might still be free. Or, the unfinished sentence hung in the air, or they might be dead, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves. Or they might be awaiting execution, imprisoned in New Orleans. There was no way to know. The trapdoor to the attic creaked open, and Baptiste's weathered face appeared. Though not yet 40, years of hard work under the Louisiana sun had carved deep lines into his features. "Militia patrol," he said without preamble. "Heading this way. You need to move." Charles tried to sit up fully, but fell back, too weak to support himself. "I can't," he admitted. "The rest of you should go. I'll only slow you down." "We're not leaving you," Marie said firmly. Baptiste's expression was sympathetic but practical. "There's no time to argue. The marsh to the east is too wet for horses. If you can make it half a mile in that direction, the patrol won't follow on foot. Too many gators. I've got a small boat hidden in the reeds. It'll take you to the Spanish side." The decision was made quickly. Thomas and another man from Bernard's plantation, Gabriel, would help carry Charles. The remaining 4 would bring what few supplies they had. Baptiste gave them crude maps scratched on pieces of bark, showing the water route to Spanish territory. "My cousin has a place just across the border," he told them. "Tell him Baptiste sent you. He'll help if he can." As they prepared to leave, Eulalie pressed a small bundle into Marie's hands. "Medicines," she whispered, "and food. God go with you." Charles, drifting in and out of consciousness, was only dimly aware of being carried through the marsh. The journey was a blur of pain and fevered dreams. Images of the uprising flashed before him: Andre's plantation in flames, the march down River Road, Quamana's final stand. Faces of the dead appeared and disappeared: the overseer Campbell, Colonel Andre's son, Quamana, and the others who had fallen in their fight for freedom. At some point he became aware of being placed in a small boat, the gentle rocking nearly lulling him back into unconsciousness. Marie's voice kept him tethered to reality, urging him to hold on, to fight the fever as fiercely as he had fought the militia. "We're almost there," she said, though Charles had lost all sense of time and distance. Just a little further. Spanish territory, safety. When he next opened his eyes, Charles found himself in a different cabin, larger than Baptiste's but still humble. Sunlight streamed through a small window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the beam. He was lying on a proper bed, his shoulder bandaged with clean linen. The fever had broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time in days. "Welcome back," said a voice from the doorway. Charles turned his head to see a tall, dignified black man with graying hair at his temples. He wore the clothes of a freedman, simple but well-made. "Where am I?" Charles asked, his voice raspy from disuse. "My home," the man replied, stepping into the room. "Name's Jean-Louis, Baptiste's cousin. You're in West Florida now, under Spanish jurisdiction, for what that's worth. The others? Safe, for the moment. The Spanish authorities know you're here, but they're not in any hurry to turn you over to the Americans, not with relations being what they are." Charles tried to process this information. They had made it to Spanish territory as planned, but their situation remained precarious. Spain's claim to this part of West Florida was disputed by the United States, and diplomatic winds could shift at any moment. "How long have I been here?" 3 days since they brought you in, more dead than alive. Your friends have been taking turns sitting with you. The girl Marie hardly left your side. As if summoned by her name, Marie appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw Charles awake. "Thank God," she breathed. "We feared we might lose you too." "It seems I'm harder to kill than the militia expected," Charles replied, with a weak attempt at a smile. Jean-Louis excused himself, leaving Marie to update Charles on all that had transpired during his illness. The Spanish governor had been informed of their presence and was deliberating their fate. The American authorities had demanded their immediate extradition as criminal fugitives, but Spain was in no rush to comply, enjoying the diplomatic leverage the situation provided. "And news from Louisiana?" Charles asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Marie's expression sobered. "Governor Claiborne has declared martial law in Orleans territory. The militias are still sweeping the plantations and swamps for any remaining rebels. The executions continue. Numbers: at least 60 of our people confirmed dead, either in battle or by execution. Probably more." Marie paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. "There's something else you should know. Dee and Isaac were captured." Charles felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Executed?" "No, not yet. They're being held in New Orleans. Dee because she's considered a ringleader, Isaac because—" Marie hesitated. "Because they want to make an example of him. Show that youth is no excuse for rebellion." The news hit Charles like a physical blow. He had encouraged the boy, given him hope, drawn him into this desperate gamble for freedom. Now Isaac faced execution before his life had truly begun. "We have to help them," Charles said, struggling to sit up despite the pain in his shoulder. Marie gently but firmly pushed him back down. "You can barely stand, let alone mount a rescue. And New Orleans is crawling with militia. It would be suicide." She was right, of course, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the burden of guilt Charles felt. He had led these people, promised them a chance at freedom. For some, like himself and the small band who had made it to Spanish territory, that promise had been kept, however tenuously. For others, it had led only to a more terrible form of bondage and death. Over the next week, as Charles regained his strength, more news filtered in from across the border. The territorial legislature was drafting new, harsher slave codes in response to the uprising. Planters were implementing stricter curfews and increasing patrols. The heads of executed rebels remained on display along the river road, a grotesque warning to any who might harbor similar ambitions. But there was other news too. Whispered accounts that spread through the underground networks of free blacks and sympathetic whites. Stories of the uprising were traveling beyond Louisiana, inspiring fear among planters throughout the South and hope among the enslaved. Charles de Londes was becoming a name spoken in hushed tones in slave quarters from Virginia to Mississippi, a symbol of resistance that could never be fully extinguished. 10 days after awakening in Jean Louis's cabin, Charles was strong enough to walk outside. The Spanish settlement was small, primarily inhabited by fishermen and a few small farmers. The locals viewed the Louisiana fugitives with a mixture of caution and curiosity, giving them a wide berth but not displaying outright hostility. Jean-Louis accompanied Charles on his slow walk through the settlement, pointing out key locations and explaining the local political situation. "The Spanish governor is using you as a bargaining chip," he explained. "The Americans want this territory and they want you handed over. Spain is dangling both just out of reach." "And when they reach an agreement," Charles asked, "what happens to us then?" Jean-Louis shrugged. "Hard to say. You might be handed over as part of the deal. Or if you're lucky, Spain might offer you passage to one of their colonies, Cuba perhaps. And if neither of those comes to pass, then you keep running. Further east into Spanish Florida perhaps, or find a ship willing to take you to Haiti." Haiti, the name still carried an almost mythical resonance, the only nation born of a successful slave revolt, now in its 7th year of independence. For slaves throughout the Americas, it represented the ultimate proof that liberation was possible, that the system of bondage could be overthrown. As they walked back toward the cabin, Charles spotted a rider approaching from the east, a Spanish soldier by his uniform. The man dismounted in front of Jean-Louis's home, where the other fugitives had gathered, alerted by the unusual arrival. The soldier spoke rapidly in Spanish to Jean-Louis, who nodded gravely before turning to translate for Charles and the others. "News from New Orleans," he said, his expression somber. "The executions of the captured rebels began yesterday at noon. 23 were killed in the first day, with more scheduled." "Dee and Isaac?" Charles asked, his mouth suddenly dry. Jean-Louis conferred briefly with the soldier before responding. "The woman was among those executed yesterday. The boy is scheduled for today." Charles felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath him. Dee, who had fought so bravely, who had carried her father's knife in hopes of using it for freedom, was gone. And Isaac, young Isaac who had endured the whip with such dignity, would soon follow her. "There's more," Jean-Louis continued after another exchange with the soldier. "The American authorities have identified you, Charles, as the leader of the uprising. They're offering a substantial reward for your capture, $5,000. The sum was staggering, more than most men, white or black, would see in a lifetime. It meant that even here, in Spanish territory, they weren't truly safe. Someone might be tempted by such a reward. That night, Charles met with the remaining fugitives in Jean-Louis's main room. Their host had tactfully withdrawn to give them privacy, though he had left 2 loaded muskets propped by the door, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they now faced. "We need to decide our next move," Charles began. "The Spanish protection is temporary at best, and with the bounty on our heads, we're at risk even here." Jupiter, who had recovered from his ordeal at the militia camp, spoke up. "I've been talking with some of the local fishermen. There's a ship expected next week, bound for Havana. The captain might be persuaded to take on additional crew." "Cuba is still a slave society," Thomas pointed out. "We'd be at risk there too." "Less so than here," Marie countered. "And from Cuba, we might find passage to Haiti." The discussion continued late into the night, weighing the risks and slim possibilities that remained to them. In the end, they decided to split up. Some would try for the ship to Cuba. Others would continue eastward into Spanish Florida, where communities of escaped slaves known as Maroons had established settlements in the dense wilderness. Charles, despite his role as leader of the uprising, found himself strangely detached from the planning. His thoughts kept returning to those who had been lost: Kwamana, Cook, Didi, Isaac, and dozens of others, whose names would never be recorded in any history. Their deaths weighed on him, a burden he would carry for whatever remained of his life. As the meeting broke up and the others retired to their pallets, Marie remained studying Charles with concern. "You blame yourself," she said softly, "for all of it." Charles didn't deny it. "I led them. Their blood is on my hands." "No," Marie replied firmly. "Their blood is on the hands of the men who held the whips and fired the guns, on the system that made property of human beings. We all chose to follow you, Charles. We chose freedom or death over continued bondage. And most found death, but they died free men and women, not slaves. There's a difference." Marie's eyes held his, fierce and unwavering. "And what we did matters. It will echo. The planters know now that their power isn't absolute, that we will resist. The next uprising might succeed where we failed." Charles wanted to believe her, to find meaning in the sacrifice of so many. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps their bloody march from Andre's plantation would inspire others, would contribute in some small way to the eventual dismantling of the slave system. Or perhaps it would only lead to harsher restrictions, more brutal repression. "Get some rest," Marie said, touching his arm gently. "Tomorrow we begin planning in earnest." But rest eluded Charles that night. He sat by the small window of Jean-Louis's cabin, staring out at the star-filled sky, the same stars that shone over New Orleans, where Isaac's execution had likely already taken place. The same stars that had guided them through the swamps in their desperate flight. The same stars that had looked down on countless generations of enslaved people dreaming of freedom. The German coast uprising had failed in its immediate objective. They hadn't liberated New Orleans or sparked a general slave revolt throughout the territory, but they had demonstrated what Marie had articulated, that the enslaved would fight for their freedom, would risk everything for the chance to determine their own destiny. In the weeks that followed, the small band of survivors dispersed as planned. Jupiter and 3 others secured passage on the ship bound for Cuba. Thomas and another man named Samuel headed east, seeking the Maroon communities in Spanish Florida. Charles, still weakened from his wound, remained with Marie and one other survivor at Jean-Louis's home, waiting for his strength to return fully before deciding his ultimate destination. Reports continued to filter in from Louisiana. The territorial legislature had indeed enacted harsh new slave codes, restricting movement and assembly even further. Militia patrols had been doubled along the river road, but there were also whispers of small acts of resistance on plantations throughout the region, work slowdowns, tools mysteriously broken, isolated incidents of sabotage. The spirit of rebellion, though driven underground, had not been extinguished. 1 month after their arrival in Spanish territory, Jean-Louis received word that American forces were preparing to move into West Florida, asserting their claim to the disputed region. The Spanish garrison was undermanned and unlikely to resist. For Charles and the others, time had run out. "I've arranged passage for you," Jean-Louis told them. "A small vessel heading for Havana tomorrow at dawn. From there, you'll be on your own, but at least you'll be beyond American jurisdiction." Charles thanked him for the risk he had taken in sheltering them. "If we make it to Haiti," he promised, "we'll find a way to repay your kindness." Jean-Louis waved away the offer. Just live free, that's repayment enough. That night, unable to sleep once again, Charles penned a letter by candlelight. In it, he detailed the German coast uprising, the planning, the execution, the battles, and the eventual flight. He named as many participants as he could remember, ensuring that their contributions would not be forgotten. He explained their motivations and their hopes, articulating the vision of freedom that had driven them to risk everything. When he finished, Charles sealed the letter and addressed it to a freedman in New Orleans, whom Jean-Louis had identified as trustworthy. Whether the document would ever reach its destination was uncertain, but Charles felt compelled to create this record to ensure that the story of their rebellion would be told accurately by one who had lived it. At dawn, Charles Deland, Marie, and their remaining companion boarded the small fishing vessel that would take them away from American shores. As the coast receded behind them, Charles thought of all they had left behind, not just the physical landscapes of Louisiana, but the dreams they had nurtured and the comrades they had lost. Their uprising had been suppressed, their immediate objectives thwarted. But as the sun rose over the Gulf of Mexico, illuminating their path toward an uncertain future, Charles understood that their struggle was part of something larger, a continuum of resistance that stretched backward through history and forward into a future they might not live to see but had helped to shape. The story of the German coast uprising would be told and retold, sometimes distorted, sometimes suppressed, but never entirely forgotten. It would become part of the complex tapestry of American history, a bloody testament to the human yearning for freedom and the lengths to which people would go to secure it. And for Charles Deland, who had led the largest slave rebellion in American history to that point, there was a certain peace in that knowledge. Whatever fate awaited him, whether further flight, eventual capture, or a new life in a distant land, he had written his name in the book of history. Not as property, not as a victim, but as a man who had dared to challenge the foundations of a nation built on human bondage. As the vessel caught the wind and surged forward toward the open sea, Charles looked back one last time at the receding shoreline. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the cane fields where their journey had begun, the river road they had marched upon, the swamps where they had fought and died. The physical evidence of their uprising would fade, buildings rebuilt, fields replanted, even the grisly display of severed heads eventually removed, but the echo of their defiance would resonate through time, a reminder that the human spirit could never be truly enslaved. Freedom or death, Charles murmured, recalling the rallying cry that had propelled them forward from Andre's plantation that fateful night. They had found both, death for many, freedom for a few. But in that desperate grasp for liberty, they had affirmed their humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. And perhaps, Charles reflected as the coast of Louisiana disappeared from view, that was a victory of its own kind. The echoes of Charles Deslandes and the 1811 German coast uprising resonate through time, a stark reminder of the brutal fight for freedom. If these untold stories of defiance and survival stir your soul, join our community. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of American slavery. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive.